She thought she could take my family's business after my mom passed. She was wrong. I ran on two kinds of fuel, coffee and worry. For 12 years, I kept the mechanic shop my grandfather started. A crooked sign, a back room stacked with engines, a counter with a jar of mismatched nuts and bolts. And I learned to keep it alive by remembering which customers came back and which cars didn't. My mother sat in the office beside me for years, knitting, reading, reminding me to eat. When her cancer worsened, I turned the stubbornness I used on transmissions toward keeping both of us afloat. Every morning started the same. I locked the shop, tipped my hat to a faded portrait above the register, and drove her to the clinic 2 towns over. Half an hour for intake, another hour of tests or chemo, then back to the shop before lunch. I'd work with one hand while my phone buzzed about blood draws. A customer might sit on the bench and keep me company while I paged through medical forms. The routine kept me tethered to something ordinary when everything else felt fragile. Our business was small, but ours. We fixed old sedans, replaced alternators cheaper than the chains, and gave neighborhood kids summer jobs so they'd learn to keep their hands busy. My mother taught me how to take deposits and write notes that made a repair feel like a promise. It was less profit than pride, something we could point to and say, we did this. She handled the paperwork for years, bills, signatures, registrations. I did the hands-on work. Losing her wasn't just losing a person, it was losing a pillar. I assumed the pillar left something strong behind. A name, a registration, a history. I didn't know someone was watching our ledger more closely than I was. The shop was our small kingdom. I'd painted the sign myself one summer, humming along to the radio while my mother sorted invoices inside. People knew us by the way we worked. Careful, honest, slow to overpromise. We kept a little ledger in which she penciled due dates and a list of recurring customers. Mrs. Calhoun's station wagon, Mr. Alvarez's pickup, and the ledger was as much a map of our life as any photograph. When a neighbor asked who would keep the place after she was gone, I said I would. She died on a Tuesday in late October, the kind of gray day that made the shop feel smaller. The chemo had taken most of her strength, but she'd kept her sharpness, the way she could still spot a wrong part from across the room, the way she'd scold me for not eating a proper meal. After the hospice nurse left, I sat in the back office with her knitting basket and the ledger open on the table like a small, stubborn testament. Funerals make you do things you'd rather not. Sign papers called distant relatives, listen to people explain condolences as if distance could be measured in polite sentences. We did it because it's what people do. We honored her, folded her into the world again. I took the week off the shop to handle arrangements and try to keep expectation low. People were kind for a few days, then they returned to their own patterns of work and family. I thought, naively, that the shop would remain exactly where it had been when I left it, my grease-scented sanctuary where our history lived in scuffed floorboards and the bent wrench over the counter. On the second Monday after the funeral, I walked down to the town clerk's office to file a small, routine form, a name adjustment on the shop's registration to reflect the fact my mother, who'd been co-signer on the lease and some accounts, had passed. It was bureaucratic, the kind of paper-pushing that requires patience more than urgency. I expected a clerk, a stamp, a small fee. Instead, the woman behind the counter looked at me with a face that tried to say something apologetic and professional at once. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, "but there's been a change of ownership filed on record. The business is now listed under Willow and Company, LLC, registered last week. The agent of record is an Irene Hargrove." The name landed like a blow. Irene, my distant aunt, someone I'd only seen at birthdays and who had a mouth that worked faster than her empathy, had always liked to make small, pointed remarks about my thriftiness and my mother's quirks. She'd been helpful in the past with tax advice when Mom wanted things tidied up. But ownership? A company she controlled? I felt a coldness in my stomach that had nothing to do with the drafty clerk's office. "You sure?" I asked because sometimes the law moves slow and mistakes are made. She handed me a copy of the filing. The signature on the organizer documents was eerily neat, professional, someone used the corporate forms. The registered agent's address matched a law office a town over. The filing date was 3 days after Mom's memorial. There are things that happen slowly, and there are moments that compress time down to a single clean point. Finding that filing was one of those points. For a second, I just imagined Irene in my mother's chair, counting invoices and sipping her tea with a smug satisfaction. It felt absurd and enraging, like a punch and a slap wrapped together. I left with the photocopy clutched in my hand and the ledger left open on the counter like an accusation. I called my cousin, the one who still lived in our hometown, and asked if she knew anything. "Irene's been talking about consolidating properties," she said, cagey and quick. Said something about making sure things are handled properly now that Aunt Margie's gone. My hand shook when I dialed the number for a lawyer I'd used years ago for a lease dispute. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. It was about a thing I'd built with my mother's sweat and intelligence being quietly transferred to a company I'd never authorized. The fight had a new shape. It would have to be legal, and it would be ugly. I remember the exact sound my jaw made when I decided I wasn't going to let this slide. A dry click, like a hinge that hadn't been oiled. I left the clerk's office clutching that photocopy and walked straight to the bank where our business account lived. The teller's polite face folded into something like confusion when I asked for transaction histories and signatory records. "We can pull copies," she said, "but you'll need to file an affidavit if someone's claiming ownership." Affidavit. That word felt heavy and formal, the kind that turned a neighborhood quarrel into a legal Cold War. I called my lawyer, Sam, who smelled like peppermint and had a bookshelf full of cases that made him look tired but competent. "We'll freeze any transfers," he said, without the drama I wanted or the melodrama I feared. "We'll check the filings. If Irene forged anything, we'll expose it." Irene. Saying her name felt like setting a bruise to air. She'd always been polished, the kind of person who wore a blazer to a backyard barbecue. I'd seen her sign her name, quick, a loop at the end, when she'd signed a condolence card at the funeral. The signature on the LLC paperwork wasn't her shaky script. It was the neat, practiced scrawl of someone else, or someone who'd practiced a lot. Sam started by requesting certified copies from the state registrar and subpoenaed the law office listed as the registered agent. He asked me for anything that proved I ran the shop. Invoices, tax filings the little ledger mom kept. I gave him boxes, receipts stacked like postcards of our life, payroll records with the same names I called every summer, a faded lease with my grandfather's scrawled initials. Each paper felt like a plank I could use to shore up the story of what the business was and who had always run it. We found quiet, small proofs, checks written by my mother to vendors with the business name in the memo line, emails where she and I planned purchases, a notarized repair agreement from 5 years ago that listed her as sole proprietor. Sam muttered as he read through things, the way he did when a file smelled promising. If Irene's filing came 3 days after the memorial, he said, that timing is suspicious. Also, why would she suddenly incorporate an LLC unless she was planning something? I asked Sam to run handwriting samples. He obliged. He also asked the bank for a log of who requested account changes and when. The bank found an online authorization to change account beneficiaries, dated a week after the memorial, submitted from an IP address traced to a public library in the next town. Someone had gone out of their way to make this look tidy and legitimate. When I confronted Irene on the phone, voice tight, words rehearsed, she laughed. I was helping sort things out, she said breezily. You know how disorganized your mother could be. I thought I'd step in. I told her I'd seen the filing, the LLC paperwork the law office listed as agent. She deflected, said she had no intention of taking the business, that she'd been practical and wanted to prevent it from being mismanaged. Sam didn't buy the laugh. We'll subpoena the library's logs, get the handwriting analyst report, he said. If there's fraud, we'll file criminal complaints as well as civil suits. My stomach turned into a knot that filled the space behind my ribs. This was no longer just about a name on a building. This was about proving I hadn't been erased. I started making lists, dates, calls, people to notify. I slept with the ledger beside my pillow like a talisman, waking to the idea that the fight had only just begun. The days blurred into paperwork. I stopped counting the nights and started counting subpoenas. Sam moved fast, the way good lawyers do when they can smell a trail. Handwriting analysts, IP logs, certified filings. Small victories arrived like bandages. The bank agreed to freeze outgoing transfers. The county clerk put a hold on any official changes. The registrar pulled an internal copy of the LLC filing. It felt good to slow Irene's machinery down, to force the world to notice that someone had slipped a cog into our life. Then the library produced the surprise I needed. Surveillance footage from the day the online change request was filed. It wasn't cinematic, grainy, a woman in a dark coat hunched over a public terminal, but it was something. Sam subpoenaed the footage and had it enhanced. The handwriting analyst compared the LLC signature to Aunt Irene's note at the funeral and to other documents she'd signed over the years. The report landed on my lawyer's desk like a gift. The analyst's opinion read, probable forgery. The signature on the incorporation documents did not match Irene's known hand. When I called Irene, her voice was placid. You have no proof, she said, as if fact were an optional thing. I was trying to get things in order for the family. Her tone was the practiced one of someone who had managed uncomfortable conversations before. But the town had been watching. Mrs. Calhoun, whose station wagon we'd fixed for 20 years, called to say she'd overheard Irene bragging at the post office about taking care of the property. Two of my summer mechanics offered statements that Irene had pressured them to sign phony invoices showing consulting for Willow and Company. Sam filed motions. We were no longer just an aggrieved small business. We were a case file with teeth. Irene's lawyer pushed back. He painted a portrait of a helpful relative who'd tried to sort the estate and claimed my mother had been unduly influenced by me to keep the shop as a sentimental favor. It was infuriating to hear my relationship with Mom cast as manipulation. I'd driven her to chemo, changed her dressings, balanced magnesium supplements while replacing alternators at midnight. The thought that a suit could turn those nights into a defamatory suggestion felt like salt in an open wound. Emotionally, the town split in quiet ways. Customers took sides in private conversations over counters. The kid who'd worked summers for us brought me a cup of coffee and said, "I'm on your side, man," like it mattered in the grand scheme, but it mattered to me. People whispered that I should accept a buyout and walk away. I considered it very briefly and then burned that thought like a draft I wouldn't sign. Sam filed criminal complaints for forgery and fraud. The county prosecutor opened an investigation. Irene retreated into legal buffers, motions, counterclaims, insinuations about my motives. It was ugly, precise, and exhausting. But every time my hands trembled with the weight of it, I'd walk into the shop and see the dent in the workbench where Mom had sat, the ledger with her penciled dates, and I remembered why I'd stayed. We were fighting for more than property. We were fighting so the small history of our life couldn't be erased by a neat, corporate line on a form. The stack of papers on my kitchen table began to look like a small, private courthouse. Invoices, bank logs, the librarian's printout, the handwriting analyst report. Each sheet felt like a small victory, but together they made the panic in my chest lighten just a fraction. Sam liked to spread them out and talk in quiet, efficient bursts, the way a mechanic talks through a repair. Remove this bolt, test this wire, don't mess with the whole engine until you've isolated the problem. The handwriting report was the one that made me breathe easier. The analyst circled tiny inconsistencies, the loop on the G, the pressure of the downstroke, and wrote, in careful print, probable forgery. It's a kind of phrase that sounds hedged because forensics has to be cautious, but to me it read loud as a bell. The surveillance stills from the public library showed a woman hunched over a terminal on the date the account change was submitted. You could see her profile and the coat she wore. You could see hesitation in how she moved, like someone trying not to be noticed. Sam turned those things into leverage. He filed motions, served notices, and the county prosecutor finally opened an investigation into potential forgery and fraud. That felt like vindication, but it did not fix the practical problems. The bank had frozen the account, so no transfers could go out. Good. But freezing also meant we couldn't pay a supplier until the judge signed a release, which took days. I got calls from customers. Some were confused, some were sympathetic, some wanted repairs but hesitated to book in case the shop closed. That uncertainty gnawed at me. We started to get statements from people who'd seen Irene around town acting like she was the owner. A former neighbor submitted a notarized affidavit that Irene had called her months earlier asking if anyone knew of legacy machinery the shop might have. Sam cross-referenced dates, and it fit the pattern. My cousin, bless her, practical and blunt, found an email chain where Irene asked an accountant about forming an LLC that would manage several small properties and included wording eerily similar to the filing. Emotionally, I was on a knife edge. Some nights, I'd sit in the shop long after the lights were off, listening to the hum of the overhead fluorescent and feeling the absence of my mother like a cold draft. Other times, I'd be at the clerk's office or the prosecutor's table, watching Sam work like he was assembling a chain of small links that might, finally, loop together into a closure. Then we hit the part of the case that makes you feel like something real is shifting: subpoena compliance. The law office named as the registered agent produced emails showing that an assistant, not Irene, had submitted forms claiming they were acting on behalf of a client. That assistant's handwriting didn't match the LLC signature either. When we confronted the law office, Their records suggested someone had presented forged power of attorney paperwork to initiate the process. It was a paper trail that smelled faintly of desperation. Sam told me to expect a formal charging decision within weeks. It was the first time in months that the timeline felt finite. I went back to the shop and ran my hands over the counter where my mother used to leave her pencil. For the first time since the clerk handed me that photocopy, I felt like maybe we were steering towards something that resembled justice. But justice, I knew now, moves on its own slow gears. We had to keep the engine running until the judge turned the key. Court dates have a way of turning ordinary mornings into fever dreams. Sam told me to expect testimony, to expect cross-examination that would feel like someone picking at a scab until the wound bled. He was right about the scab part, and wrong only in that the days before the hearing were quieter than I imagined. Not calm, just the low, steady hum of legal machinery moving toward a moment that would decide whether my life's work stayed mine. We spent those mornings preparing exhibits like mechanics prepping an engine for inspection. I sat with Sam at a small conference table while he organized binders, each one a curated narrative. Exhibit A, bank freezes and transaction logs. Exhibit B, handwriting analysis. Exhibit C, library footage and timestamp metadata. He labeled things with post-its and underlined phrases in a slow, meticulous way that made me believe the case might be winnable. He took my statements and turned them into interrogatories, phrasing the obvious in legal language until it sounded heavy and official. Emotionally, the preparation was a different kind of assault. I relived every sick day, every appointment, the evenings when I'd prop Mom on a pillow and tell her stories about the shop, because she liked to hear the names of customers as if they were characters in a radio show. Sam kept asking questions that hurt in practical ways. Who was present on certain dates? Who had keys? Who had access to documents? It's one thing to know you took care of someone. It's another to be forced to show receipts for it. Meanwhile, Irene's team filed counterclaims focused on an alleged informal agreement between me and Mom during her final months. The implication being that I had somehow coerced or encouraged her to keep the business in a way that benefited me. It was infuriating to hear. It felt like reductive theater, turning late-night caregiving into a calculated plot. Sam prepared responses to each insinuation with a dispassionate efficiency that made me trust him more than I trusted anyone through this. We met with the county prosecutor once the criminal forgery complaint moved forward. He was a lean man with a grave face who explained the difference between our civil options and the criminal case. Civil would determine rightful ownership and damages. Criminal could lead to charges if the evidence proved forgery beyond a reasonable doubt. Both can run, he said, and often they do. Hearing the words beyond a reasonable doubt made it feel suddenly much more serious, like we were asking the state to call someone out for having tried to pull the rug from under an entire life. At night, in the shop with the lights low and a space heater ticking, I would run my hands along the ledger my mother kept and memorize the dents in the bench. A neighbor brought over a pie and stood awkwardly by the counter, saying, "If you need anything." The generosity felt both huge and small. It couldn't substitute for the reality that our accounts were frozen and supplies sometimes delayed because of paperwork. On the morning of the preliminary hearing, I remember walking past the back room where the old transmission lay on a pallet, thinking about legacy, how it's not only what you leave behind, but what others try to take. The hearing would test both narratives. Mine that this was a theft by paperwork, theirs that it was a legitimate transfer. I draped my jacket over my arm and went to court with a stack of binders and the kind of exhausted hope that lives in people who've rebuilt engines in the dark. Courtrooms have a way of shrinking you down to the size of your paperwork. The judge was a woman with a steady voice and glasses that slid down her nose like she'd read too many petitions in her life. Sam and I sat on one side, Irene and her counsel on the other. The air was thick with that brittle hush people use when they think something important is about to be said. When the prosecutor called the handwriting analyst, I felt my palms go slick. The analyst explained, carefully, the small ways a forged signature gives itself away. Inconsistent pressure, unusual slant, hesitation marks where a genuine writer's hand would flow. He held up enlarged copies of the LLC signature and compared them, loop to loop, downstroke to downstroke, to Aunt Irene's funeral card and old property deeds. The phrase probable forgery sat there again, but this time spoken into the record by someone with an expert stamp on it. Then the library tech testified. The grainy footage was played back on a screen. In a clip, a hunched figure moved through the frame, sat down at a terminal, and typed. It wasn't cinematic. It was ordinary, the way bad deeds usually are, small actions done in public spaces because the perpetrator assumed distance meant safety. Sam slowed the footage and the tech traced the IP request to a machine that had logged a download of the power of attorney form. It was a file I now knew had been manipulated. Irene's lawyer tried to make the case about motive, that Aunt Irene had acted in good faith, that she'd been trying to protect assets. But then something unexpected happened. The assistant from the law office named on the LLC filing was called. Under oath, she said she'd been handed a stack of documents by a woman matching Irene's description, but the paperwork she'd received included a power of attorney that bore a signature unfamiliar to her. When pressed, she admitted she'd been told the documents were legitimate and filed them. The law office, in turn, produced emails showing they'd acted on materials supplied by an outside party. It was a cascade: the analyst's report, the library footage, the assistant's testimony. Sam cross-referenced dates, and a pattern emerged like a map. Someone had assembled a paper trail to mimic legitimacy, using a public terminal and a hastily produced power of attorney as the linchpin. The prosecutor leaned forward and asked gently, "Who provided these materials to the law office?" The assistant's voice trembled. "I was told they came from Ms. Hargrove." It wasn't a confession, but it was a thread tugged loose. By the end of the day, the judge issued a preliminary ruling to suspend the LLC's claim on Willow and Company pending a full criminal investigation. The county prosecutor announced they'd open a formal forgery inquiry. The bank, which had already frozen the accounts, filed a notice to reinstate our access subject to court instruction. The legal wheels were turning in our favor, but the judge cautioned that criminal matters take time and that civil relief, permanent restoration of title and damages, would require further hearings. Walking out of the courthouse, the October air hit me like a damp towel. I felt elated and hollow at the same time. We'd won a meaningful skirmish, not the war. Irene's face in the parking lot was unreadable. She signed papers with slow fingers. Mrs. Calhoun found me on the sidewalk and hugged me like she'd been saving that embrace for weeks. I drove back to the shop with a box of exhibits in the passenger seat and a weird, new lightness in my chest. The ledger on the counter never looked quite as fragile again. We had court victories on paper, and more importantly, we had time to keep the doors open while the law did its work. For the first time since that photocopy shook my world, I slept for more than 2 hours straight. It felt like a small, stolen mercy. The week after the hearing felt like walking through a town where people had learned a secret and were handling me differently for knowing it. Some of that was kindness. Mrs. Calhoun leaving overalls by the back door, the high school kid who used to help me change oil bringing a box of donated parts. And some of it was wary curiosity, like people watched a glass repairman after he fixed a window, appreciative but cautious not to touch. The prosecutor moved faster than I expected. Within days, the county filed formal charges for forgery and fraud against whoever had manufactured the LLC paperwork. It wasn't a sentence. It was a legal acknowledgement that someone had tried to rob us with a typewriter and a lie. The criminal case allowed the bank to unfreeze enough of our operational accounts to buy parts and pay the suppliers who had been patient. That relief tasted like diesel and coffee, practical and necessary. And for the first time in months, the shop's phone rang with appointments again that I didn't have to turn away. Sam negotiated with vendors, explained there was a court hold, but that the presumption of my running the business was intact. People who owed us money came by to pay their tabs, embarrassed, apologetic. The town's small economy breathed a little easier. Legally, we were still in the thick of it. Sam filed a civil suit to void the LLC transfer entirely and to seek damages for the losses we'd endured. Legal fees, interrupted business, emotional distress. The filings were dense and formal. They smelled like the work of someone building scaffolding around a broken wall. Irene's lawyer countered with motions and delays, the old tactics of the well-resourced, but the county prosecutor's involvement made the posture different. It's one thing to argue in civil court about intent. It's another to face criminal scrutiny. The assistant at the law office who'd filed the documents cooperated with investigators and provided emails that suggested she'd acted on papers handed to her and approved without deeper verification. Her cooperation didn't absolve Irene, but it did embolden our case. Emotionally, I felt whiplash. Vindication came in slow, bureaucratic doses. A subpoena complied with, a forensic report finalized, a prosecutor's press release that used the word indictment. But those victories sat next to nights that were heavy with what had been lost. During the worst moments, I would stand in the shop after hours, run my hands along the ledger my mother kept, and let the silence fill the space where her voice had been. The legal success mattered, but it didn't stitch up the hollow that loss left. On the practical side, life went on. I rehired one of the summer kids full-time. We repainted the sign. The paint needed touching after months of neglect, and the workbench began to feel like a living thing again, covered in rags and tools, and the slight smell of oil that had always meant home. The townspeople who had been watching started bringing meals again. The woman who owned the bakery left us bread on Thursdays. We weren't out of the woods. The criminal case would take months, and civil damages would have their own calendar. But the immediate threat, the sudden bureaucratic theft of everything my mother and I had built, had been turned back. That, for now, was enough to keep the lights on and the engines turning. It was a gray Thursday when the prosecutor called me into the office. He didn't call me by my first name the way our neighbors did. He used my last name, and that made it feel official in a way that never used to. "We're moving forward," he said, sliding a stack of documents across the table like a small, cruel present. "We filed charges. There's enough to pursue forgery and fraud. Expect a grand jury date." My gut did a somersault the size of an engine. For months, we'd been tacking little wins onto a ragged life. The bank thawing a portion of the account, subpoenas returned, the assistant's compliance. But this was the first time the state put its shoulder into it. It meant the town's quiet gossip would be replaced with paperwork that had teeth. It meant the possibility of seeing Irene, not as the aunt who brought casseroles, but as someone who could be held accountable in a courtroom. The grand jury was a sterile thing, a hallway of muted carpets and coffee machines, rows of chairs, men and women who didn't look like the neighbors who cheered me on. Sam coached me on what to expect. "They're not deciding guilt," he said. "They're deciding whether there's probable cause to charge. But from there, things could go to trial." I slept badly the week before, waking to the memory of Mom's handwriting in that ledger and the sound of a wrench falling to the concrete. When we presented the evidence, the pattern we'd been stitching together over months finally read like a paper map. The handwriting analyst testified with a careful cadence about matches and mismatches. The library tech walked us through the terminal timestamps. The assistant from the law office spoke under oath about handing over paperwork and about being told, repeatedly, that the documents were legitimate. The grand jurors listened. The foreman scribbled notes. At the end, the prosecutor looked at me with something like the exhaustion I felt. "We can seek an indictment," he said. A few weeks later, the press release came out, and the tiny county paper ran it. Local LLC filing under scrutiny. Charges filed in alleged forgery case. Irene's name was in it. My palms sweated as if I were standing over an engine with the hood up. Irene's reaction was what you'd expect from someone whose life had been about appearances, indignant statements, an attorney who spoke of misunderstandings, and a public posture of shock. But privately, I heard she'd started selling property, hurried transactions that reeked of panic. The criminal process moved slowly at first. Plea hearings, motions, stalled discovery. But then things accelerated. A late-night disclosure from a co-conspirator we hadn't banked on, emails that placed Irene at the center of communications arranging the LLC push, and finally a plea deal that would spare her a jury trial, but not the consequences. She admitted to falsifying documents, agreed to restitution, and accepted a suspended sentence contingent upon payment and community service. It didn't feel like triumph exactly. It felt like the legal system resolving a ledger in the only currency it speaks: fines, probation, and forced admissions. The county moved to void the LLC filing, and within a month the registrar issued paperwork restoring Willow and Company to its pre-filing status. When I walked into the shop after the notice arrived, the light looked ordinary in a way that made me weep. Nothing dramatic, just the normal, honest light of a place that belonged to the hands that worked there. We were back on paper, but the cost of coming home was stitched into the months behind us. Legal bills, frayed nerves, the taste of betrayal. Still, when a customer squeezed into the doorway with a muffled, "You open?" and I replied, "Yeah, we're open," the word felt like a small reclamation. When the registrar's letter arrived officially restoring Willow and Company, the paper felt like a small miracle and a sharp reminder at once. A legal fix, yes, but not a cure for the months of scraping and strain. I sat at the counter with the envelope in my hands, the fluorescent light buzzing above like an old friend clearing its throat. For a long time, I just let the silence sit around me. The same silence that had once meant my mother had fallen asleep in her chair. Now it felt like a pause before repair. The shop came back to life the next morning the way a stubborn motor roars into action after sitting. Reluctant at first, then growing convincing. We ordered parts that had been delayed, paid overdue bills with checks the bank finally released, and called the vendors who'd been waiting. Customers trickled back. The kid who'd worked summers showed up to help. Not because he owed me anything, but because people in small towns vote for you with their presence. His easy grin felt like a repair I hadn't known I needed. The restitution payment from Irene, part of the plea deal, helped with immediate recovery. It didn't erase the legal bills, and it certainly didn't buy back the late-night calls or the oxygen of a lost parent, but it kept the shop from sinking into the red. We set up a repayment schedule for the remaining creditors, and Sam negotiated a fee plan that was merciful in its own legal way. I learned to be frugal with the confidence that, after months of being on edge, stability would grow back like moss on a foundation. Irene paid her price in court and in town gossip, but she never walked into the shop again. People told me she moved away. Some said she took a job in another state. Forgiveness didn't feel like a necessary ledger item. Accountability did. The assistant at the law office who'd filed the paperwork cooperated with investigators and later apologized in a letter I received at the counter. I slid it into a drawer marked records, the way you keep receipts. Not because paper can heal, but because it helps you remember what was true. More important than money, though, was the slow doing of rebuilding trust. I called old customers personally, not with sales pitches, but with simple updates. We were open, the tools were the same, the promise still stood. People brought pies and parts, and neighbors offered to mow the sparse patch of grass out front. There were awkward moments, small talk about the trial, eyes darting like instruments testing for hidden screws, but they eased with time. On slow afternoons, I would sit and watch the afternoon light cross the workbench and think of Mom's handwriting in the ledger. I'd trace the penciled dates with my finger like a map back to patience. Running the shop again taught me new things. I set up a better filing system, got a dedicated business account that required 2 signatures for big transfers, and bought a simple camera for the office terminal because the library footage had shown me how much the world could misread a public space. I hired a part-time office manager, so paperwork wouldn't become a back-burner chore while I fixed engines. We put up a small plaque in the back room with my grandfather's name and Mom's, the way you put names on a bench to say this is where we stood. At night, when the lights were off and the town was a low hum, I still felt the ache. What we'd lost was permanent, and the months of paranoia had left thin scars. But the shop had returned to being a place of ordinary work and ordinary kindness. A man brought in a car with a busted taillight and jokingly asked if I'd signed anything away lately. I laughed, fixed the light, and handed him the receipt with my name on it. It read Willow and Company, proprietors, me. The ledger my mother kept still sits on the counter. The pencil marks are smudged in places, but the dates line up. I add entries now with a steadier hand, payments, parts, the names of kids who come for summer jobs. I keep it as she did, not because it's a talisman, but because it is a story written in tiny, ordinary strokes. Someone came, someone fixed what was broken, someone paid, and we moved on. If there's a final note to all this, it's not legal victory or town gossip. It's this quiet fact: we built something with hands and memory, and when someone tried to paper it away, people who mattered showed up to help rebuild. The shop is not the same as it was before the fight. It bears new marks, but it's ours. I turn the sign every morning, open the door, and the little bell rings. The sound feels like a promise. I keep showing up. Update 1, 6 months later. Hey, everyone. I didn't think I'd be back here writing again, but after the last post about my aunt trying to steal the family shop, a lot has happened. Some of you sent messages asking how the business was doing, and whether Irene, yes, the infamous Aunt Irene, ever tried anything else. Short answer: the shop is alive, I'm still standing, and Irene, well, she managed to surprise us one more time. 6 months after the court decision, life settled into something close to normal. The bills were mostly under control, customers returned, and we even took on a couple of new contracts with a local delivery company. I thought we'd put the whole mess behind us. But last month, I got a letter from a lawyer representing Irene, this time demanding reconsideration of the restitution terms. In plain English, she wanted to reduce the amount she still owed, claiming financial hardship. I won't lie, opening that letter made my stomach drop. Part of me was angry, part of me just tired. But I also knew she didn't have a legal leg to stand on. My lawyer Sam called it a desperate attempt to poke holes in a sealed jar. We filed a short response, pointing out that the restitution was part of a plea deal, not negotiable. End of story. The court tossed a request out within a week. The funny thing is, the more Irene tries to fight, the more the town seems to rally around me. Last weekend, a local bakery dropped off a big box of pastries with a note. For someone who knows how to stand their ground. That meant more than they probably realized. I also made a big decision. I brought on a new partner. Not a family member. Learned that lesson. But a longtime friend named Carla who's been in auto repair for years. She handles most of the business side now, and I focus on the workbench. It feels good to know that if anything happened to me, the shop wouldn't just disappear. So yeah, shop's open, bills are getting paid, and Irene's last swing missed by a mile. But something tells me she's not done being Irene.